Good morning, church. It's so good to get to have the chance to preach in front of you all today. I know normally I'm out of order because normally I'm before this, and Pastor Will took my place this time, and I'm taking Pastor Anne-Marie's place. But it's a joy to get to be here and to get to share a message with you all. I'm going to start with a few questions. Why do bad things happen to good people? Why do the innocent suffer? Why is there so much injustice in the world? These are the deep, meaningful questions you would probably expect to find in an adult Sunday school class, maybe a meeting between clergy or a chamber full of philosophers. It is certainly a question that I myself have battled with for many years, only to find that there's not really a good answer for it. Yet the most striking iteration of this question came to me in the form of a third-grade camper at Glen Lake Camp one year. He approached me during reflection, and with the most sincere and worried look on his face, he asked me, "Why does God make bad things happen?" Sometimes it may seem that questions like these are too big for little minds to comprehend, but the reality is that with the heaviness of the world and how immediately available all of that heaviness is for us, I found that wrestling with this question is almost a prerequisite to being a Christian. And unfortunately, not all of us have the luxury of getting to openly wrestle with these dilemmas. I, as with many other children growing up in church, was often given the answers of, you just gotta trust God. You just gotta be faithful in times of trouble. Or my all-time favorite, everything happens for a reason. And don't get me wrong, these are not bad answers. In fact, they are true. We do have to be faithful in times of trouble. We do have to trust God in everything. And God does make good things out of every situation, even the bad ones. However, I find that knowing these fundamental truths of Christianity doesn't entirely answer the question. Not because they are bad answers to the question, but perhaps because the question, why does God allow bad things to happen, cannot be answered from our human perspective, at least not fully. Maybe the answer to this dilemma is something that our understanding can only begin to approximate. The text we're covering this morning, which comes from the book of Job, is an attempt at doing just that. For those of you unfamiliar with the story of Job, it's the book of, Job. A man who was righteous before God and one day was tested by Satan, the opponent, to see if he would remain faithful to God if he were to lose everything but his life. And at first, Job managed to stay pretty faithful. But eventually, the piling amount of misfortunes got the best of him, and his heart started to harden before God. Our scripture reading this morning catches Job at the height of his suffering during an intellectual conversation with his three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. It reads, "Oh, that my words were written down, inscribed on a scroll, with an iron instrument and lead, forever engraved on stone. But I know that my Redeemer is alive, and afterward he will rise upon the dust. After my skin has been torn apart this way, then from my flesh I'll see God, whom I'll see myself. My eyes see, and not a stranger's. I am utterly dejected." Oh man, as you can see, Job is really going through it here. He is at a point in his pain where he doesn't feel like God is hearing him anymore, where he's desperate for answers and for justice, and where he really wishes he could just have a conversation with God about everything that's happening. I know that usually when my feelings come out, they don't come out as articulate and well put together as Job's do, but I do know that I've shared some of his sentiments before. I wonder how many people hungry on the street who are being failed by careless and oppressive systems feel like God doesn't hear their prayers. I wonder how many of us look at the world and long for justice. And I wonder how many of us would give up everything for the chance to ask God one question. Yet, I am also aware that many of us understand why Job is wrong in questioning and demanding answers from God. The other perspective that we get to see in the book of Job is that of Job's three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. Among the many things they say, they argue that Job should humble himself and understand that his suffering is a direct result of his iniquity, that he needs to remain faithful to God, and that in being faithful to God, he will be eventually delivered from his suffering. This exchange of ideas between a disgruntled Job and his convicting friends bears some resemblance to those statements I made previously. I see the parallels between this conversation happening with Job and the conversation that a Christian with a shaky faith would have with friends who are trying to make him feel encouraged spiritually or to remain faithful. What's even more enticing about the book of Job is the way that both sides kind of present their argument. See, Job wasn't just some random guy from the land of Uz. No, he was the guy. He was the most faithful. He was right before God. He was considered one of the top faithful people in his area. And his friends were just as wise, just as experienced, just as knowledgeable. They both had valuable insight. In the past, when I had felt drawn to the book of Job, I was encouraged to read it as a way to answer some of my heavy theological questions. I felt the pull, expecting to find some of those answers, but what I found in reality was more like a philosophical game of tennis, where every perspective shot back something that made me go, oh, wait, yeah, that's interesting, and back and forth, finding something interesting from both sides. The fascinating thing about the book of Job is that it provides a multitude of perspectives, all valid in some way. As I was preparing my message, I was captivated by a statement made in the Interpreter's Bible. It says, what gets challenged in this process, that being reading the book of Job, is the very notion that discerning truth is a matter of choosing one perspective and rejecting all others. That the truth about a complex question could be contained in a single perspective. This book sheds light to the limited scope of our individual human perspective and how the truth can only even be approximated when we stop to consider what each other person has to offer. Perhaps among the many perspectives being shared by Job's friends, the hardest one to grasp is the notion that every single thing that is happening to Job has a reason. From the three friends' perspectives, Job is in need of repentance because he has done something to warrant all his misfortune. But from Job's perspective, he believes himself to be blameless and righteous and demands an explanation from God. If we keep with our understanding that there are multiple valid perspectives in this book, we can also pick apart points of criticism from each perspective. On one side, from our Christian perspective, we know that we're all sinners, that we're not without sin. And thus Job's statement that he's fully blameless before God isn't entirely true. On the other hand, though, from the context of the book, we do know that Job didn't do anything to earn the misfortunes he's experiencing. So no, Job isn't entirely blameless, but also, no, Job didn't do anything to earn his misfortunes. And see, this is the kind of uncomfortable tension we tend to encounter in our journey as Christians. Our faith leads us to wrestle with the reality that we are imperfect beings in an imperfect world. Yes, met and loved by a gracious and loving God, but who constantly face trials, suffering, and tribulation that is sometimes greater than any bad thing we had ever done. It seems unfair, sometimes even nonsensical. And naturally, this kind of tension would lead some of us to seek to answer the hard questions, maybe even fabricate our own answers. This kind of dilemma is what has fueled the mission of what many would call the prosperity gospel. For those of you not aware of what the prosperity gospel is, it's basically a circle of people that likes to push the idea that if we behave faithfully and do every single thing right, rewards and good things are sure to come our way. And that the opposite is true if you don't behave faithfully. But what Job's story highlights is the reality that there is no guarantee in either of these directions. And that any attempt to sway destiny in either direction is nothing more than an attempt for us to control the very thing we cannot control. In her book, Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I've Loved, Kate Bowler shares her experience battling stage 4 colon cancer and the different spiritual realizations that her troubles revealed to her. During her recovery from stomach surgery, she shared a powerful reflection on control. She says, control is a drug and we are all hooked. Whether or not we believe in the prosperity gospel's assurance that we can master our future with our words and attitudes. I can barely admit to myself that I have almost no choice but to surrender, but neither can those around me. Surrender. A word that to many people may sound like giving up is instead used by Kate here to define a posture of holy acceptance. Acceptance that the world is chaotic and unpredictable, and that part of our role in Christian community is to act where we can and humbly choose surrender where we must. And when our brothers and sisters face their own trials, rather than seek a way to make sense out of everything they're going through, perhaps we find ourselves invited to hold the tension with them in an act of collective, peaceful surrender. After all, the hard truth is that it is possible to be a faithful servant of God and experience misfortune. And the realities of the world show us that it is possible for someone who withholds kindness and goodness from the world to seemingly experience fortune. Part of this holy work of surrender involves knowing that the heavenly rewards from God aren't things from this world, but rather spiritual rewards. In the book of Hebrews, Paul makes a point to remind us that many of God's servants, the very ones who became the standard of faithfulness, Abraham, Moses, didn't get to see the fruit of their labor during their lifetime. It wasn't until they passed and returned to God that they were able to receive the riches of the kingdom of heaven. And at the center of this understanding comes the wisdom that God is so much bigger than anything we can see, than anything we can hear, and anything we can experience. Speaking of, there's actually a third perspective in the book of Job that I haven't brought up yet. Job spent so much of his time in the book wanting accountability and explanations from God that, spoiler alert, our story reaches its grand conclusion where God actually shows up and confronts Job. Now, I wish I could tell you that God gave Job the answer he was looking for, but at this point, I think we can all assume that that isn't what happens. Rather than an answer, God gave Job something even more precious: perspective. Now, I'll be the first to admit, perspective used to not be my favorite thing. I, like Job, I'm someone who likes to have easy, clear answers to every situation. It's so comforting, but so unrealistic. I am grateful that I have met mentors and loved ones in my life who liked God, who pointed Job to perspective, have pointed me towards a broader perspective, when all I wanted to do was grab my gavel, say case closed, and cast my imperfect judgment on other imperfect people. Now, I can imagine that Job wasn't initially pleased that he wasn't receiving the answer he wanted, but he quickly came to understand God's point. See, God took Job into what was basically a tour of the universe and said to him, "Are you able to do this? Are you able to understand this?" He showed Job that there are things he could never understand, because the only being able to comprehend the full complexities of chaos and order, right and wrong, good and evil, is God. In other words, God made it clear to Job that there are truths about the universe that only God can see. And so Job is brought into a posture of humility, not because he was shut down, but because he was given an opportunity to understand what he could never truly understand. Job is made right before God when he is humbled and repents. And his friends are called out for not speaking right about God. Now, what exactly the three friends got wrong is not specified. That's for theologians to discuss about. But the beautiful thing about God's response is that God doesn't address the specifics of anything said by Job or by his three friends, because that was never God's point, nor was it the point of Job's story. God's point in providing perspective is to show us that sometimes what doesn't make sense to us may be a matter so big our human mind simply cannot comprehend it. But that the unexplainable does not deny God's love for us. On the contrary, it is a reminder that the God of the whole universe, the one who made everything we know and everything we don't know, sees us too, loves us too, and is constantly working in our favor too. These matters of justice, fairness, steadfastness, piety that are discussed by Job and his friends, they are important. But discussions such as these require the humility to surrender and accept that the truth for all these matters may be something only God will ever know. And of course, from my perspective, that is easy to say. But I am aware of how difficult it is to engage the world with such an understanding. The tension of being a Christian is just so real. Like Job, our hearts should ache for justice when we see the wicked hoard riches and deny basic necessities to the innocent, the poor, the needy. But we must remember that the kingdom of heaven is not of this world, and that while it seems like God allows the wicked to prosper here, they will truly reap what they sow when they come face to face with God. And like Job's friends, we should feel empowered to encourage, strengthen, and even give conviction to our fellow Christians when their faith feels shaky. But we must sympathize and hold this tension with our brothers and sisters who find themselves amid suffering that sometimes just doesn't make any sense. When their questions carry an anger towards God, just like Job's did, we must be as understanding as we are spiritually encouraging, because in one way or another, we've all been there. There just isn't one single answer for all of it. One of my favorite moments shared by Kate Bowler in her book is how she describes the presence of her community. She says of her loved ones, "I did not tell them how few of their words are needed, but how much of their hands are wanted. A hand on my back as I tear up, a hand on my head for a soft prayer of healing. When I feel I am fading away, these hands prop me up and make me new." I can't help but wonder how different the encounter between Job and his friends would have been if, instead of engaging in a tennis game of logic, they would have simply taken more time to share in his grief, to model some of that peaceful surrender. There won't always be a reason why bad things happen to us, and we won't always be getting exactly what we deserve, be it good or bad. Our job as Christians is to faithfully hold the tension that is present in almost everything we do. The tension that our hardest questions may never have an answer. The tension that the closest thing we could ever get to finding an answer is the faithful discussions we have with one another. The tension of knowing that there are truths far too big for anyone other than God to comprehend. And that even when it feels like heaven isn't listening, God is present, God is loving, and God is holding that tension with us. To further echo the words I read in the Interpreter's Bible, it may be that the truth about a complex question can only be spoken by a plurality of voices that can never be merged into one, because they speak from different experiences and different perspectives. As the book of Job illustrates, serious theological conversation places different voices in relationship precisely so that their limitations as well as their insights may be clearly identified. So next time you see yourself invited to discuss the reason why bad things happen, or the nature of injustice and suffering in the world, know that there is most likely no good answer other than the mutual opportunity for you and your loved ones to discover more of who God is and more of how God interacts with us. Or maybe you'll do what I did and look at that young third-grade camper with just as an earnest face as he gave me, and you'll say, "You know, buddy, that's a really good question. I can point you to some ideas, but the truth is, I just don't know." Will you go to pray with me? God, we understand that sometimes the world is too big and complex for us to understand. And we thank you for your grace and for your love and for your presence and for how you deliver us from difficult situations. We admit that we can't know everything, and sometimes that's hard to grasp. But we are faithful that among all the difficulties of the world, the things we can and cannot change, God, you are loving and faithful. And I pray that we all may know just how much we are loved by you. Amen.